Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome, everybody. Great to have you guys here today for week number 2 in this teaching series entitled This I Believe. And we're taking a couple of months this summer to talk about what we believe, the core of our faith as Christians. And we're building this teaching series on the framework of the Apostles' Creed. And the Apostles' Creed has been around for over 1,000 years. Believers all over the world for the last 1,000 years have recited and memorized the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed is simply a summary of our theology. It's a summary of what we believe as Christians in a very succinct form that's easy to recite and memorize. And so we began this series last week, and last week we just started with the first 2 words, I believe. And Dan White did a phenomenal job introducing the series and talking about what it means to really believe something. Now today, week number 2 in this series, we want to cover this first full sentence in the Apostles' Creed that says this: I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. And these 12 words are the starting point for everything else that we believe. And they have to be, because everything else that we believe hinges on what we believe about God. Back in the mid-1900s, there was a pastor and writer by the name of A.W. Tozer, and in his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, he said this. He said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. The gravest question before the church is always God himself, and the most important fact about any man is not what he may say or do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like. And I couldn't agree more with A.W. Tozer that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us, because the way that we see God will shape our decisions. The way we see God will affect how we respond to the pain and the difficulty in life. The way that we see God will dictate our priorities. The way we see God will either motivate us to worship him or keep us from worshiping him. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And so let me ask you a question. What do you think about when you think about God? What comes into your mind? What image do you have when you think about God? Let me give you some examples of some of the ways that people tend to think about God, just to get you, thinking about this. Maybe your image of God is something like this. Okay, when you think of God, you imagine someone who is just sitting back and judging your performance with a critical eye. A God who is hard to please, and you go through life wondering if you're going to measure up. You go through life wondering if you're going to kind of make it through to the next round. That's your image of God. Or maybe your image of God is really at the opposite extreme. When you think of God, you think of someone who is meek and passive and speaks in very soft tones, as someone who would never be offensive to anyone. And so you pay a visit to his house once a week, and he puts on his cardigan sweater and he gives you a warm welcome. That's your image of God, kind of the Mr. Rogers God. Or maybe when you think of God, you think of God kind of like OnStar. You can get this option when you buy a new car, especially a GM car. And OnStar is a really cool, amazing thing. You're driving down the road, and if you need something, you just push the OnStar button, and then a voice speaks to you from the system, and it says, hello, Mr. Stenzi, how can I help you today? And I say, well, I'm lost. Can you help me find the nearest Krispy Kreme donut shop? And then the OnStar will help you. It not only gives you directions, it can unlock your car, it can send help. If you have a flat tire, it can help you find a hotel. It's amazing. Some people think God is a lot like that. Whenever you're cruising through life and you have a problem, you just kind of push the God button. And God says, Bob, how can I help you today? And God does whatever you need him to do. And then you say, thank you very much. And you go on your way, on your journey, and don't think about him again until another problem comes along. Or maybe your image of God is kind of the stained glass God. The stained glass God is the God who lives at church. And you see this God when you go to church, and then when you go home, you go back into the real world. The stained glass God stays at church. And the stained glass God uses words that you don't fully understand, like thee and thou and soteriology and eschatology, not really in touch with the world that you live in every day. It's the God of, church. Many Americans, if they're honest, would say, their image of God is something like this. Like what many people want to do is they want to pick and choose the things about God that appeal to them and maybe even pull in some things from other religious systems. And they say, I'll take the golden rule, 6 out of 10 of the commandments, I'll take that. Maybe a little bit of reincarnation and some political correctness and just push the button and blend it all together and I make up God as I want him to be. But to be honest, for some of you, when you think of God, this is what you think of. Because you're not even sure that he even exists. And if you ever wrestle with that, this is the place for you to be, because we are a church that welcomes people who struggle with doubt. So, what comes to your mind when you think about God? And here in the opening sentence of the Apostles' Creed, in these 12 simple words, we get an accurate picture of God, an accurate description of God. In fact, it answers for us 2 very important questions. It first of all answers the question, is God there? And it answers that first question, does God exist? In those first 4 words, it gives a resounding yes. It says, I believe in God. Yes, God does exist. And then that leads to a second question, if indeed God does exist, what is God like? And I love these 2 words in the Apostles' Creed because the combination of these 2 words is such a compelling description of the true nature of God. 2 simple words that tell us so much about him. The first word is Father, and that speaks of relationship. There are only 2 people in this entire world who can call me Father. I have a unique relationship with them, a deep love for my daughters. We have a strong bond of love and tenderness because I am their father. It's a word that speaks of this powerful, powerful relationship. The second word, though, is just as important, the word Almighty, because that speaks of the fact, it reminds us that it is God alone who possesses ultimate power and authority. So much power that he is, as it says here, the creator of heaven and earth. And now for us, sometimes when we think of power, we think of people who abuse their power. We think of people who are power hungry, people who use their power to oppress others. But this doesn't just say that God is almighty. He says he is the Father Almighty. In other words, his power is always exercised in the context of his love. His power is always exercised in a way that is best for his people. So let me give you a phrase that I think describes God. And a phrase, if you really want to understand the nature of God, if you want to have an accurate image in your mind of what God is like, this is a phrase that I think will be very helpful. First of all, it says God is. He does exist. But God is infinitely powerful and intensely personal. He is the Almighty and he is the Father. He is infinitely powerful and intensely personal. And I want to talk about this phrase and unpack this phrase for the rest of our time. And as we do that, I want to draw your attention to a passage in the Bible in Acts chapter 17. And in this part of the Bible, there's a group of people here that had a very inaccurate, distorted image of God. And in this message that they hear, Paul, leader in the early church, is helping them to have a correct understanding of who God really is. And so Acts chapter 17, in case you're not familiar with the Bible, the book of Acts, it's part of the New Testament. Whenever you see Acts, just think action. It's the story of how the early church sprang into action and literally changed the course of history in the first century. And as I mentioned, Paul was one of the leaders in the early church. He's a central character in this story that we're about to read. But Paul, he was actually a Jewish rabbi for most of his life. And then he became a follower of Christ in a dramatic conversion. And then he spent the rest of his life declaring the message of Jesus, the message of the gospel, to people who might not otherwise hear it. He traveled all over the world. And in Acts chapter 17, he comes to the city of Athens. Okay, now the city of Athens was a very, very important city in its day. It was the capital city of the Greeks. It was also, in that day, the intellectual and cultural center of the world. Like some of history's greatest philosophers came from Athens, like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And Athens was also, by the way, the birthplace of the modern day Olympics. So it was a very large city, very progressive city. You know, think Seattle or San Francisco or New York. That was Athens, okay? So in chapter 17, verse 16, we'll pick up the story. Paul is here in the city of Athens, and he's waiting for some friends who are planning to meet him there. And here's what happens. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Now, when it says here the city was full of idols, that is no exaggeration. According to historians, there were literally thousands of idols in the city of Athens. On public streets, inside of temples, on public buildings. Like idols in Athens was like pizza places in Old Forge. Okay, there were lots of idols there, which tells us something about the people who lived in the city of Athens. They were searching. They were looking for something. They had a sense that there was something out there beyond themselves, and they were reaching to find it, and yet they were looking in all the wrong places, which means that the people of Athens were a lot like the people of the United States of America, because we do the very same thing. But here's what we think when we read something like this. We think, well, you know what? We're smart, we're sophisticated, we live in the 21st century. We don't worship idols. But I want to tell you that idolatry is just as common today as it was then. It's just that our idols have different names and different sizes and different shapes. But idolatry is alive and well because the human heart has a built-in desire to worship something, to find meaning in something. And if we don't worship God, we will try to fill our hearts with the worship of something else. It may be sex, it may be money, it may be comfort, it may be power, it may be all of those things, but we go through life seeking to find something that is meaningful to fill the emptiness in our hearts. But nothing in this world will do that completely, because the emptiness in our hearts is a God-shaped emptiness. There was an interview on 60 Minutes a few years ago with Tom Brady. Tom Brady, as you know, is the quarterback for the New England Patriots. He is one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game of football. The guy is 40 years old. He's still playing, hoping to play until he's 45. He's got 5 Super Bowl rings. He's got a net worth of about $100 million. But when he was being interviewed on 60 Minutes, he admitted that in spite of everything that he has achieved, he still had this sense that there was something missing. Here's what he said in that interview. He said, "Why do I have all these Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me?" I mean, a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what it's all about. Me, I think it's got to be more than this. I love playing football and I love being quarterback for this team, but at the same time, I think there are a lot of other parts about me that I'm still trying to find. Now, Tom Brady is a guy who would be the envy of just about every man in America. He's got about everything you could ask for and everything that most of us are desperately trying to get, and yet he admits that he's still got something in his heart that isn't fulfilled. There's still this emptiness inside that he's trying to satisfy. And so what Paul sees in Athens, he comes to Athens and he sees this city full of idols. What he sees there, we see all around us today. And it says that Paul was greatly distressed to see a city full of idols. He was greatly distressed to see people who were chasing things that would not answer their deepest questions. And so what does he do? Does he boycott the idol factory? Does he start a political action committee against idols? No, he engages people in redemptive conversation. Verse 17, here's what happens. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. Now, The marketplace, reasoning in the marketplace, don't think, the checkout line at Target where he was creepily standing and waiting for people to come through so he could target them. No, the marketplace in that day was really the cultural center of the city of Athens. It was where you went to catch up on news, to debate politics, to do business, to see your friends. And so Paul takes this message of hope to the very cultural center of one of the most progressive cities in the world. But it wasn't long before he was caught up in a debate. Verse 18. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Just curious, any philosophy majors on any campus? Any philosophy majors with a job? I'm just kidding. They began to dispute with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. Now, let me stop and explain that. The Areopagus was a group of about 30 men. They were the intellectuals. They were the thought leaders in the city of Athens. And they would hold their meetings on top of a very large rock in the middle of the city that was called Mars Hill. In fact, if you visit the ruins of Athens today, you can still walk the marble steps that people have walked for thousands of years to get to Mars Hill. This was where the Areopagus would meet, this group of leaders. And so back to verse 19, here's what happens. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we want to know what they mean." So he's got this golden opportunity to influence the influencers. And Paul goes on here to give this incredible explanation of the heart of God and the message of Christ. And the way he does this is so incredibly wise, and it's a model for us in how we engage our culture. So here's what happens. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" And so Paul is like immersing himself in the culture and finding these connecting points with the truth. And apparently, in spite of the fact that in the city of Athens, they had these thousands of idols, they also created this kind of just-in-case altar. Like, just in case with all those other idols, we missed somebody, this one's for you, okay? This is to you, unknown God. And so he makes that his starting point. He says, now what you worship is something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. So he starts with something that they would have been familiar with in their culture, and he makes that his beginning point. He's so relevant, and then he opens their eyes and their hearts to the truth, and he gives this very brief message, and we won't even cover the whole thing, but at the beginning of this message that he gives there to the Areopagus on Mars Hill, he declares three things. Number one, he declares this, that God is. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. And so he begins this message by saying, listen, there is a God, one God, who created this world, and he's not a God that could ever be created by you. And by the way, this starting point, this part of Paul's message, this is exactly the opposite of what we hear every day in our world today, because the prominent voices of our culture have been telling us for decades that there is no God, that our existence on this planet is strictly the result of time and chance. About 20 years ago, there was a documentary on public television. I saw part of it. It had a very interesting title. It was called A Glorious Accident. And the title really caught my attention because I've had several traffic accidents, none of which were glorious. I've raised two kids who had all kinds of accidents. None were glorious. We've had different dogs over the years who had accidents in our house. They were not glorious. I don't think I've ever seen a glorious accident. But there was this mini-series on PBS, and the basic premise of it was this, that the world that we live in, the universe that we live in, as beautiful as it is, it's really nothing more than a glorious accident. And the voices that we hear every single day in our world tell us that over and over and over. And when we begin to believe that, I think that has a tremendous impact on the way that we think and the way that we live. Because imagine this, imagine you're a child and your parents tell you every day that you were an accident. They didn't plan for you, they didn't want you, you just showed up one day, you were an accident. Tell me, how would that make you feel? See, I really believe that one of the reasons why we see so much anxiety and so much hopelessness in our culture today is that most people have been convinced that they are nothing more than an accident, that there is no author to this story, there is no meaning to this world, there is no bigger purpose behind it. I mean, we live in a time and a place where we enjoy so many blessings. We have the best health care in history. We have access to more information and more education than our grandparents could ever have dreamed of. We can travel almost anywhere in the world. We can communicate with almost anyone in the world. I mean, we have so much, and yet suicide rates are escalating. Drug use, especially opioids, is rampant. Depression is more and more common. Why do we have so much and yet feel so empty? I believe that primarily it's for this reason. We have been told that we are nothing more than an accident. There is no God. You are not loved. There is no meaning to your life. There is no greater purpose. There is no grand ending. It's all just an accident. Reminds me of a story Frederick Buechner once told. It's the story of a teenage boy who somehow got a hold of a gun, and in a fit of anger and depression, he shot and killed his father. And when the police detective asked the boy why he had done it, he said it was because he couldn't stand his father. His dad was just too demanding, too strict, too repressive, and he just wanted his freedom. And so, of course, he was arrested, tried, put in prison, and after he was placed in a prison cell, a guard was walking by his cell late one night when he heard the sound of crying, and he stopped to listen. And the words he heard this boy saying through his sobs were these: "I want my father. I want my father." And I think the story of that boy is a parable of our modern world. We have gotten rid of God. In a sense, we have killed him. But there's an emptiness inside of us. And in the quiet moments of our lives, we reach out for him, we cry out for him, but we are not sure even how to find him anymore. And so Paul, he begins this message and he says, God is. He is there. You are not an accident. And then he goes on to state a second truth, not only that God is, but that God is infinitely powerful. He goes on to say this, verse 25, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. There is a God who needs nothing and who created everything, a God of infinite power. The next book in the Bible is the book of Romans. It's a letter that Paul wrote to the Christians in the city of Rome. And in chapter 1, he said this. He said, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. In other words, the evidence of God's power is all around us if we care to notice, if we care to look at it. In fact, the more we discover about the inner workings of this world, the more obvious it becomes that this is not just a glorious accident, that there is a powerful creator behind all of it. One of my favorite examples of the power of God is demonstrated in the intricacy of creation is, and I talk about this sometimes, is the human eye. I mean, the human eye is simply amazing. Do you know that on a clear day, a human being with 20/20 vision can see an object 40 miles away? And then within 1 second, your eyes can shift from focusing on that object 40 miles away to focusing on a grain of salt on your fingertip in less than a second. Little trivia question for you about eyesight. How many different shades of color can the human eye distinguish? Any idea? 10 million. shades of color can be distinguished by the human eye. There's no man-made device that comes close to the sophistication and the effectiveness of the human eye. In fact, one scientist said it this way: to suppose that the human eye, with so many parts all working together, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Do you know who wrote that? Charles Darwin, in his book, The Origin of the Species. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal in December of 2014 entitled, "Science Increasingly Makes the Case for God." This article was posted online. It was shared 600,000 times on Facebook, received over 10,000 comments on the Wall Street Journal website, the most read article in the history of the Wall Street Journal. Science increasingly makes the case for God. I wish I could read the whole thing. I can't. Let me read a couple paragraphs. In 1966, Time magazine ran a cover story asking, "Is God dead?" Many have accepted the cultural narrative that he's obsolete, that as science progresses, there is less need for a God to explain the universe. Yet it turns out that the rumors of God's death were premature. More amazing is that the relatively recent case for his existence comes from a surprising place: science itself. Today, there are more than 200 known parameters necessary for a planet to support life, every single one of which must be perfectly met or the whole thing falls apart. The odds against life existing in the universe are simply astonishing. Yet here we are. What can account for that? At what point is it fair to admit that science suggests that we cannot be the result of random forces? Doesn't assuming that an intelligence created these perfect conditions require far less faith than believing that a life-sustaining earth just happened to beat the inconceivable odds to come into being? The odds against earth existing are so heart-stoppingly astronomical that the notion that it all just happened defies common sense. But listen, you don't need a scientist to tell you that. You don't need the Wall Street Journal to tell you that, because you know that. Every time you see a newborn baby, every time you watch an eagle fly, every time you sit and observe a sunset, there is something in your heart that tells you there is an infinitely powerful God behind all of that. So Paul gives this message to the sophisticated people of Athens. He says, God is, and God is infinitely powerful. And then he declares one more truth, that God is intensely personal. From one man, he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times set for them in the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Paul says, not only is God infinitely powerful, he is also intensely personal. He is not some cold, impersonal deity carved in stone and confined in a temple or a church. He is near, he says, to each one of us, involved in our lives, stirring in our hearts, drawing us to himself, pursuing us relentlessly, and as we'll talk about next week, pursuing us even to a Roman cross. And so Paul wraps up this part of his message in verse 29. He says this, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In other words, he says, you're surrounded by all these false images, but you have missed the reality of who God is. This is the reality. God is, first of all. But he is infinitely powerful, and yet at the same time, intensely personal. In 1962, when John F. Kennedy was the U.S. president, Life magazine published a series of photographs of his family. And one of the pictures showed him with his children, John and Carolyn, in the Oval Office, in the office of the most powerful man in the world. And I love this picture. They're dancing. He's clapping for them. Do you know what's in this picture? Great power and great love. And to me, it's a picture of this, that God is infinitely powerful, and yet at the same time, he is intensely personal. And you see these two ideas side by side all throughout Scripture. Jesus one day was teaching his disciples to pray, and he said this then is how you should pray. Our Father, intensely personal, in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, infinitely powerful. Psalm 62, 11 and 12 says it this way: one thing God has spoken, two things have I heard, that you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are loving, that you are strong, God, and yet at the same time you are loving. Strong and loving. That's what we all want deep down inside, right? I mean, even when we were young, that's what we wanted. We wanted our fathers to be strong enough and big enough to protect us. And yet at the same time, when our fathers dealt with us, we wanted them to be gentle and tender, strong and loving. You wanted the policeman on the corner to be strong enough to back down the biggest bully, and yet you also wanted him to care enough about you to take you by the hand and help you find your parents when you were lost. Strong and loving, that rare combination of those two traits, it's what we've always longed for deep down in our hearts. God is infinitely powerful and intensely personal. So let me ask you to think about something this week. As you leave here today, I want you to fill in this blank. If I truly believe in God the Father Almighty, I will. How would you fill in that blank? If you really believe this is true, if I truly believe in God the Father Almighty, I will trust Him more and worry less. I will live more boldly and be less concerned about what other people may think about me. I will enjoy what I already have, knowing that my Father in heaven has the power and the love to provide anything else that I might need. I will share my faith with conviction, knowing that I follow, I believe in, and I'm in the hands of the powerful and loving God who is my Father. How would you fill in that blank if you truly believe this? How will it change your life? Now, I want to give you two homework assignments before you go. The first thing I want to encourage you to do is this, to take advantage of some resources, because we always think it's great to continue learning after you leave church. And so we offer this thing called Right Now Media. And Right Now Media is like the Netflix of Christian Bible studies, okay? There's over 10,000 different videos on Right Now Media. And just because you attend Parker Hill, you can get a free password to sign on to Right Now Media. Doesn't cost you a thing. We pay for that. And if you don't have a password, email us. We'll give it to you. But you can go on Right Now Media, and there are three video series that I'll recommend that these all have to do with understanding what you believe and understanding how to communicate what you believe. And the beautiful thing about all three of these, and we'll put these on our Facebook page too, the beautiful thing about all three of these is that they're videos that are between 3 and 7 minutes in length, all of them, okay? The first one is called Speak by Sean McDowell. The second one, Think Like a Detective by J. Warner Wallace. He was actually a cold case homicide detective. He was an atheist who became a Christian by using his detective skills. And so he talks about how you can approach your faith and think like a detective. And this one called Nua, that's by Johnny Somerville, who's actually Irish, so it's fun to listen to. So discover what you believe. Take advantage of Right Now Media. Listen to some of those videos. Here's a second assignment, and I want to have the band come on back up because we're going to close with one more song in just a moment. But here's your second assignment. Summer has just begun. And if you're like me, you're going to spend a lot of time outside in the summer months because we get this narrow window of opportunity to actually enjoy the outdoors here in northeastern Pennsylvania. But here's what I hope you'll do. I hope while you're enjoying the summer with friends and family, you'll also take some time to notice the beauty of this world and to recognize in the beauty of this world the hand of a powerful and loving God, and to intentionally remember that. And as you see that, and as you remember that, even this summer, as you're out there doing whatever, that even you'll take some moments to stop and to worship the God who is so powerful and so loving to create you and this world around us. And that's what we're going to do as we end our time together today. We're going to ask you in a few minutes to join into a song that was written about 800 years ago, actually, by St. Francis of Assisi. It's a song that reminds us that all creation around us sings the praises of God and declares to us that He is infinitely powerful and intensely personal.